Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. Really happy to welcome you all to our meeting today, Climate Action Down on the Farm, looking at food and climate nexus opportunities for the U.S. and China. This is the second in a year-long series of conversations that we're going to be having at the China Environment Forum, looking at the climate footprint of food. It's a kind of new, maybe it's become recognized finally, but it's been around for a while, but it's really more new kind of climate conversation. For 23 years, a lot of my climate meetings on US and China have focused on the power sector, transport, steel, cement. But now we're going to start opening the door and investigating food, because food systems from production to disposal account for something like 31% of greenhouse gases in the world. And as food superpowers, what the US and China decide to do or not to do around food production emissions, it'll determine how the planet goes forward. Now, my panelists today are going to give you kind of an overview about what is the global food climate challenges and the opportunities for US and China to take action. It's a big topic. We're just going to be scratching the surface, but it's going to be a little bit deeper scratch than earlier. And so I'm really grateful for all the speakers that have come today and for you in the audience joining us live today. You can actually really join. If you look underneath the screen, there's a little widget for you to submit questions. Put your name and affiliation if you can, and you can ask every 10 minutes. No more than that. So you could start asking questions anytime on the widget for me. So we're going to start off today with David Sandalow. He's going to set the stage to kind of give us the baseline understanding is, well, David, like, what do we mean when we say food system and climate change, and what is this nexus? And also talking about the work that he's doing at the Columbia University Food Climate Partnership. Oh, not yet, David.
Okay.
But yeah, that's okay. You could have it ready, but I'm just going to lay out. No, you're fine. But I just want to give the whole overview of who's talking. So David is an inaugural fellow at Columbia University's Center for Global Energy. He directs the U.S. China program and helped co-found the Food Climate Partnership. We know, well known in DC because he used to work at the White House, State Department, DOE, a lot on U.S. China climate relations. So you can pepper him with questions about that later too. And following him, he's got two of his colleagues from Columbia. There's Sally Chiu and Hern Halder Dr. Heidas Doctor. They're going to share insights from the Food Climate Partnership's new publication called China Spotlight. That's going to be introducing some of they actually went out and tried to figure out, so what are China's emissions from the food sector? So I think it's really exciting. It's the kind of research that we need to see. Sally is a research associate who mainly focuses on low carbon transition, food systems, and US-China relations. And Hun is the founder and CEO of a startup in Iceland that's looking at using waste heat and CO2 from geothermal plants for greenhouses. And she used to also work at the FAO doing environmental agri research, which is, I think, why she got nabbed to be part of this partnership. And then we're going to invite Patty Fong. Some of you probably saw her a couple of weeks ago. She came and did a green tea chat with me about her work at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, about the kind of the urgent global food system transformation that's needed. And she's our commentator today. So she will leap in after the first three speakers and ask them difficult questions and make some comments. Isn't that kind of a fun role to have there? She's like, yeah, sure. And then the next two speakers that we'll wrap up today, they're going to turn the conversation to the farms. If we're going to change climate in the food sector, what happens down on the farm is going to matter. And so we've got Zhenzhong Se, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Waterloo University. He does research into rural China development, and he's a big food guy, looking at food security, food safety, and food sustainability with boots on the ground. He's going to offer insights looking at kind of the top-down policies and bottom-up action in agroecological initiatives in China, and that they're trying to respond to some of the food challenges in China. And then wrapping it up will be Karen Mansell, who's a professor in food, agricultural, and biological engineering at The Ohio State University. If you've been tuning into my project for the last few years, you might have noticed that for the last 4, Karen's been writing lots of blogs, doing research, and speaking for me. She's been really kind of infusing more rural China and a little more science into my project. So this is a good thing. She's going to examine the success of sustainable agriculture in the US and China and look at the kind of policies that might incentivize farmers to take action on greenhouse gas actions. All right, now is the time, David. Share that Zoom. And you in the audience, remember, ask questions. And yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here. All right, David, the stage is yours.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I'm sorry for jumping the gun. Thank you for pulling together this really important conversation on the food system and climate change, in particular the role of U.S. and China. And of course, U.S. and China are the world's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases. There is no solution to the challenge of climate change without the U.S. and China. And I've been working on this issue for many years and have had the same experience that Jennifer reported, which is a lot of the conversations that I'm in focus on power plants, focus on the transport sector, focus on industry, all of which are hugely centrally important. But in my experience, the food system and the role of the food system and its relationship to climate change hasn't gotten enough attention. And so I really appreciate Jennifer's efforts to help shine a spotlight on this, in particular, how it can, how the U.S. and China really can work together, contribute to solutions to this problem. So I'll just start out with the statistic that Jennifer's already mentioned, which is hugely important, which is that 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. And when I first saw that statistic a number of years ago, I was very surprised. It seemed like it was more than could possibly be the case. But on reflection, realized what's in the smaller text here, which is that, of course, food is a central part of the human experience. We all eat food every day. And so it's not surprising that the vast infrastructure we've built for this core part of the human experience is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And figuring out how we produce, transport, process, store, prepare, and dispose of food in a zero emissions world, or a net zero emissions world, I think is one of the core challenges that we will face in the decade ahead. But very importantly, the impacts go both ways. As not only does the food system affect climate change, but climate change dramatically affects the food system. Around the world, we have rising temperatures, changing weather patterns, and they're already suppressing global average crop yields, threatening damage to crops, food supply chains, and rural livelihoods. In the United States today, in the South and Southwestern United States, we have yet another run of record warm temperatures. One of the predictions of climate scientists in a world in which heat trapping gases have accumulated in the atmosphere is that we will have both more droughts and more floods. And it's maybe ironic, but the total amount of water in the world doesn't change, but it comes in more intense bursts, meaning more intense rainfall events, and then that leads in turn to more droughts. That is exactly what we've seen in recent years and recent decades, and the 21st century is going to be characterized by that unless we can get a handle on greenhouse gas emissions globally. So because of these relationships, a group of us have formed the Food Climate Partnership. It's as Jennifer was starting to say, it's a group of researchers at Columbia, at New York University, at the Food and Agriculture Organization, and in other places, who are animated by this food climate challenge. And our kind of tagline is better data, better policy, and better engagement. We're a new organization, only a couple of years old. And here's our mission: to achieve net zero, we must zero in on the food system. And if you'd like to know more, let's see why. Like to know more, please go to foodclimatepartnership.org, foodclimatepartnership.org, and learn about what we're doing. I'm particularly thrilled to announce that one of our co-founders, Professor Cynthia Rosenzweig at Columbia, just a few days ago was awarded the World Food Prize. It's just an extraordinary honor, reflecting her lifetime of achievement in this area. And we're really honored to be able to work with Cynthia on all of these challenges. So just a word about some of the work we've done and the food system. So here is a diagram of the food system, which we prepared and have published. And It's reflects the complexity of the food system, but going everywhere from fertilizer and pesticide manufacturing in the top left, all the way to incineration and disposal in the bottom right, with lots of intermediate steps that I won't go into here, but I'll show you kind of how to find this if this is helpful and interesting to you. One core point that a few of us have focused on is that the food system, the energy system are deeply intertwined. I've worked for years on the energy system, and about 30% of global energy use is related to the food system in some way. Most of that comes from fossil fuels, but the share of renewable energy in the food system is rising, and that's going to be extremely important to mitigation of global climate change. Here's the same chart that I showed earlier with red borders around the areas of the food system that are particularly intense in terms of energy use. And then here's some analysis that we've done that's been then published in environmental research letters and peer-reviewed journals. This is kind of part of our better data mission. And this is, it shows the amount of emissions in each of these stages of the food system. And this is work that my colleague Sally in particular, who you'll hear from, has done some great work in, and some others. And just I could talk for a while about each of these. I won't right now, but I think it's striking, for example, that just in fertilizer production is 0.4 gigatons. That is almost 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from production of fertilizer for agriculture. And overall, 16.6 gigatons, 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We also talk about better policy, and science and policy need to be deeply connected. There's no good policy unless it's informed by the best science. It's absolutely essential. Sometimes policy impulses can head in the wrong direction. I've seen this actually in a different area in air pollution control, unless there can be many different sources of air pollution, and there are instances in the world in which well-intentioned people trying to mitigate local air pollution have taken steps that have not been helpful, precisely because the science of that air pollution was not understood. And we're working in the Food Climate Partnership to integrate the science and the policy in this area. And here's policy approaches. They include supply side strategies, demand side strategies, and strategies for improving resilience. Just say a little bit about each of those. Supply side strategies, I won't go into each of these bullets, but maybe just the top bullet in each of these. So improving agricultural productivity, absolutely essential for addressing this issue. We need more and more nutritious crops grown on less land as part of the strategy for addressing the relationship between food and climate change. Lower on-farm emissions, reducing methane emissions from livestock production is absolutely central. Livestock production is about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There are strategies for reducing methane emissions, including feed, including various innovative technologies that need to be pursued. And then efficient distribution systems, increasing energy efficiency across the supply chain is key. So the takeaway here is there's a lot that can be done. And there's a lot that can be done on the demand side too. And this is a statistic that a lot of people invoke that I think is important to pay attention to, which is that roughly 30% of food that is produced is never eaten. Food waste is endemic throughout the food system. Finding ways to reduce food waste that reduce greenhouse gas emissions can make a big difference. I'm running short on time, so I won't focus on all of these demand side strategies, but there are lots of them. And if you'd like to know more, I urge you to look for our food and climate change info guide. And if you just search on those words, food and climate info guide, I think it'll pop up. It's on the website of our Center on Global Energy Policy, but we look at the issues that I was just talking about. The food system, we look at the food system, climate change, and then the impacts of food system and climate change on each. I'll just wrap up with a quote that I thought was particularly helpful from the Eat Lancet report a couple of years ago. It said, "Food is the single strongest lever to optimize health and environmental sustainability on Earth. However, food is currently threatening both people and planet." There is so much more we can do to build a sustainable food system that will that will help to protect the people and nourish people and protect the planet in the years ahead. So back to you, Jennifer. Thank you so much for convening this once again.
No, thanks so much. And maybe later, yeah, definitely want to see that PowerPoint more. I think that demand side things, both the charts were great. But speaking of good charts, I think we want Sally and Hun to upload their PowerPoint. That was a great introduction, David, kind of helped set the stage. And now let's go a little deeper on your data. I also like your tagline, zeroing in on food waste, on food. Can you share your PowerPoint, Sally? There we go. Okay, thank you so much. So now a little ping pong presentation between Sally and Hun.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for inviting us to be here and tell you a little bit about what we've been working on. So today, Sally and I are going to talk about a product of the Food Climate Partnership called the Food and Climate Change Country Spotlights. And let's just dive in. Now, the Country Spotlight it's a product of the Food Climate Partnership, and it's a short document in which we take a country and we put it in the spotlight and view it through the lens of the food system and climate change. So basically, it's a collection of summary briefs aiming to provide a systematic overview of each country's food system, including food production, consumption, and trade, and food-related greenhouse gas emissions, as well as listing food-related nationally determined contribution targets and food climate policies and actions. So the idea is to bridge the gap between science and policy with a double helix approach, as David previously mentioned, by combining data-driven research and policy analysis, and to put it side by side in one document. And the idea is really that the Country Spotlights, we think of it as a series of documents that are all created in a standard template in order to easily compare countries. And today we will be talking about our work on the China Country Spotlight, which is actually the second release in the series following the Iceland Country Spotlight. But then the plan is to do more countries that are both diverse from a geographic and economic perspective. But why are we doing this? Well, by placing the numbers side by side with each country's NDC targets and policies, the aim is really to highlight how food-related activities in each country affect climate change and vice versa. And we also hope that by listing both food-related targets in the NDCs and some actual policies and actions that have been announced or implemented, we can see how those complement each other. I mean, are real actions and policies in line with the data? Are they in line with the targets listed in the NDCs? Do the NDC targets lack further plans for how they are actually to be achieved? Because the NDC targets, they are often big and ambitious, but it's not always clear how they are actually to be achieved. And one example that comes to mind is actually from our work on the Iceland Country Spotlight, where two of the targets listed in Iceland's NDC are climate-friendly agriculture and carbon-neutral beef production. And the main actions listed to follow up on these particular targets are to educate farmers. Now, what that exactly means and how the impact of that action can be measured does certainly pose some questions. But the Country Spotlight is just as much about shedding a light on the numbers as the policies. And so some of the work that the Food Climate Partnership has indeed been doing is to work on filling the data gap on greenhouse gas emissions from global food systems. And in our Country Spotlights, we include data from FAO-Stat's new database on pre- and post-production activities, including emissions from food waste and food transport. And we will continue to add more parts of the food system once new data becomes available. Because we believe that it's important to view the food system from this larger perspective, because that expands the potential for designing some mitigation strategies across the entire food system, and not only to focus on agricultural production and land use management, as is currently mainly found within countries' NDCs from what we have found. And finally, one of the potentials that we see with this product, the Country Spotlights, is to spark a conversation with policymakers and experts in its country. And we truly hope that this series of documents can prove useful for such conversations.
Thank you, Horn, for such a great introduction of the China Country Spotlight. So now we're going to look at China Country Spotlight more in detail. So this slide shows the topics covered in this document, which we'll be also going over in the same order. So by land areas, agricultural land takes more than half of China's total land areas, and among agricultural land, about 3/4 are meadows and pasture, and the rest are cropland. And on production, as we can see from both the chart and the table on this slide, China is the world's largest agricultural producer, and China also leads the production of vegetables, grains, fruit, and meats. I think it is particularly interesting to know that China produces only 5.5% of the world's soybeans compared to some of the larger producers, including the United States, Brazil, and Argentina, making China really dependent on importation for the soybean consumption. And on consumption, as we can see, people in China consumes a lot of rice, wheat, pork, vegetables, and potatoes. And from the table on the left-hand side, we see per capita, people in China consumes about 1 ton of food per year, and averaging it to about 2.7 kilo, which is about like 5 pounds per day per person, which is kind of an interesting number to think about. Most notably, we see meat consumption has been growing more rapidly than grain consumption over the past few decades, and China is now one of the largest meat consumer in the world, with pork being the main source of meat consumption. However, if we look at the per capita stats versus the total number, it's somehow a different story. So per capita meat consumption in China, it's only 64 kilo per capita a year, which is only half of that of the United States, Australia, and Israel. Now we'll look at trade. So from the two charts on the right, we see both China's export and import of agricultural products are on the rise during the past 2 decades. However, overall, China is a net food importer, meaning that we import more than we export. So we're the largest importer of agricultural products and the 5th largest agriculture exporter, following the United States, Netherlands, Brazil, and Germany. And not surprisingly, as we already mentioned earlier, soybean is among the top products for import in China. And actually 90% of China's soybeans are imported from other countries like Brazil and the United States. And China also imports a lot of pelagic fish, which are like sardines, herrings, and tuna, as well as palm oil. So now we're going to look at the most crucial part of this product, which is the food system emission. And by food system emissions, we're looking at 3 major parts, which are farm gate activities, land use changes, and pre and post production activities such as household consumption, fertilizer manufacturing, food waste, and transportation. The statistics we're using here are mainly from FAO's recent statistic update, and as we mentioned earlier, like our group, we're very proudly to be part of these the FAO collaboration for updating the statistics. So overall, China's agri-food emissions are pretty significant. Just based on the current data available that we calculate, it contributes to at least 14% of China's total greenhouse gas emission in 2019. And we believe a systematic approach is very important when looking at the food system emission, because in the case of China, as we can see from this pie chart, the pre and post production emissions are actually much more than the farm gate emissions in China. So now we look at the more specifically on the farm activity emissions. So farm gate activity consists of both non-energy activities and such as agriculture and energy activities. And the total farm gate emission was almost 800 million tons in 2019, which is equivalent to 8.3% of China's total greenhouse gas emission of the same year. And then we can see that from the pie chart, the most significant source of the farm gate emission is actually enteric fermentation, which contributes to a lot of the methane emissions, as well as the synthetic fertilizer, which is a large source for nitrous oxide emissions. The emissions from land use change related to agri-food production is actually pretty minimal compared to other sources, contributing to only like 0.01% of China's total greenhouse gas emission. And then this is a very interesting part, is the pre and post production emission. As we can see, China emitted more than one gigaton of CO2 equivalent from these activities. And the most significant source is actually food household consumption, including cooking and the use of appliances, followed by food waste and fertilizer manufacturing. In total, the pre and post activities contributed to more than 8% of China's total greenhouse gas emission in 2019. And now we're going to look at some of the policy measures has been announced or implemented in China. So this one is about the updated NDC that was released last October on agri-food related content. The new NDC covers 4 areas, including agriculture, waste management, food-related land use, and diet consumption. Compared with the previous version from 2015, many new measures has been added, particularly to the area of agriculture and food-related land use. Some of the notable new measures include improve agricultural climate zoning, strengthen sustainable agriculture development, refine management for manure for livestock and poultry breeding, promote energy saving emission reduction technologies in agriculture fishery, and make an effort to return farmland to forest and grassland. There are also 3 measures mentioned on the diet and consumption area, which is actually not new. It was already in the 2015 version, including curbing waste, promoting low carbon development of food services, and improving green government procurement policy. However, we do note that the NDC did not provide a very clear and detailed implementation plan for all those measures. And besides NDCs, China has also released a series of food-related policies, including the most recent the Clean Plate campaign announced by President Xi in 2020, and the follow-up anti-food waste law released in 2021. It's important to know that although they're food-related, but both measures were actually established on the basis of reducing food waste and ensuring food security, rather than focusing on climate change. In particular, the anti-food waste law allows food services to charge extra fee for people leaving excessive amount of food uneaten, and it also bans vlogger making binge eating videos on social media. It's very hopeful because last year in October, the action plan for carbon dioxide peaking before 2030 is actually the first policies that kind of bridge the gap between food and climate change. So the plan mentioned measures like reducing food waste in catering industry and developing low carbon technology for agriculture, such as low carbon greenhouse, eco-friendly cookers, electric agricultural vehicles, and energy efficient fishing boats as measures as part of China's carbon neutrality and the carbon peaking plan.
Okay, so just very briefly to sum up some of the lessons learned so far. To begin with, we have found that it is indeed very useful to take a country one by one and put it in the spotlight, because every country is different. The challenges each country is facing are different. And when we do research on larger regions or global systems, we tend to make assumptions that maybe don't always apply. One example of this is from when we were making the Iceland country spotlight, and we found that there was a large gap in the way the Icelandic national data and FAO stat were accounting for emissions from land use change, and forestry, because FAO stat was actually largely underestimating LULUCF emissions in Iceland because it usually works as a carbon sink. Whereas, however, in Iceland, LULUCF emissions are actually nearly double all other emissions combined, with the main reason being drainage of wetlands to create grassland for farming. So this is just a small example of how important it is also to do some kind of study cases on smaller regions or specific cases.
And once again, putting together this food spotlight really reminded us the importance of looking at the food and climate issues from a more systematic and integrated approach. So this systematic approach can be applied to both areas of policy and data, better policy and better data. So on the policy side, we realized although food and climate as two separate topics has both been getting increasing attention, but policy measures still need to be established to bridge these two areas, food and the policy. Data, it is important to take into account of pre and the post-production emissions besides just the food production direct emission, as pre and post-production activities actually contribute more to greenhouse gas emission. And all those activities are deeply embedded into other areas and the supply chain as well. Right. And then when we are also looking at the study, we also realize it's important to look at both per capita versus total amount when looking at indicators of a certain country, because the per capita versus total amount could paint very different pictures. And as I mentioned, meat consumption and agricultural emission in China are two examples. When look at a total amount, China is always the world's, the biggest emitter, the biggest consumer. But when it looks like per capita, we sometimes are roughly like make to world's average and then below the per capita amount of a lot of other countries.
I think we're running out of time, but just last and not least, what we have learned is that data can tell a very interesting story. So we look forward to doing more work on more countries and put them in the spotlight. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Karen and Sally. Yeah, you could take down your slides, and now we're going to have a Patty hop on in here. But it's great. No, data can tell interesting stories. And I'm glad I love the stuff with Iceland, because like the assumptions were not what everyone thought. So Patty, do you have some questions or comments for these three?
A couple of comments and then a question to the team. So really, really enjoyed hearing the presentation. And I just want to emphasize how important it is that we have moved from a specific focus on agricultural emissions to a more holistic integrated food systems approach. And you can see that, that how food systems touches on just a much, those interlinkages, but that is still, I think, kind of that shift that you see amongst us, this kind of community, but has not yet spread to, let's say, the policymaking community. So for example, we also did an NDC assessment from a food system perspective. We looked at 14 countries, and most countries started to look at agriculture, but not at all on the food systems perspective. So they really left out a lot of opportunities to be integrating perhaps policies and programs that have been integrated by other or adopted by other ministries, but not considered a climate measure. And this, for example, is China's food waste programs, which it's amazing. Like U.S. should have an equivalent. It doesn't have it yet. China has one yet. It was adopted last year, but it wasn't yet included in the NDCs or referred to sufficiently in its NDC. So that's just a really important example of how better coordination across ministries, across the board. Another, you had raised in one of your last slides about imported emissions. We looked at all the 14 countries. No country that we had looked at considered imported emissions. We are seeing some changes. So for example, the UK and European Union are starting to look at legislation to start to consider that, but that's also a significant shift in terms of greenhouse gas emissions accounting, which will have huge reverberations. So it'll be good to watch that space, but I think so important as we consider this from a food systems perspective. The third point is around the measures. I think, David, you threw up in your slides around all the various measures, especially on let's say the production side, and they're made them touch on the principles of ecological agriculture or agroecology, regenerative agriculture, refer to these terms, which I know Zhang Zhongsi and Karen will probably go into in more detail, and just emphasize that this is not new for China, right? It's something that has been in China's history. So look forward to hearing more about what happened, right? It's not that we need to go back to the past, but what happened in that kind of the history, and how do we start to shift gears? And then I know that, David, you didn't have enough time to go into more the demand side, the diets piece, and this leads into my question is that, you know, in addition to all the emissions related statistics that you've just shown us, you know, China succeeded in terms of addressing its food security goals. You know, undernutrition has dropped from 23% in 1990 to 2.5% in 2020, so in a matter of a few decades. But on the other hand, obesity and diet-related diseases have increased significantly, right? So now, over the last 2 decades, 1 in 3 adults are considered obese, right? So it's a significant number. So, you know, and health expenditures at the same time are also increasing for China. So, and this is a problem not just for China, but for many countries, right, that are dealing with changes in the food system, this increase in consumption of not only meat, but of ultra processed foods, of oils, like just our diets are changing. But as we know that in order for countries to really be truly adopting and implementing climate measures, it has to be paired with other political, social, environmental, health priorities. So as you go on and start to collect more data, will you be looking at some of these other health aspects? So for example, not only on diets, but around food safety, around chemical exposure, a lot of these, you know, if you start to add up these impacts, they make a huge case for transforming our food system. So over to you to see what you have planned ahead.
I'll just start if that's okay, and then Harn and Sally, you could jump in. But let's see, Patty first. Just totally on. You know, thank you, and every point you just made is so key and central to work in this area. And you asked whether we're looking at nutrition and relations with climate change, and the answer is yes, absolutely. And there's some very interesting and disturbing data about the impact of rising concentrations of heat-trapping gases on the nutritional content of various crops. And there's pretty interesting science on this, and it's a sobering picture. And as heat-trapping gases accumulate in the atmosphere, we see, you know, declining, you know, mineral content, vitamin content in various food products. Another point you touched on, which I think, you know, we've touched on so far, but I think important to highlight, is the central role of food and culture. And everything we're talking about needs to recognize that. And, you know, in many ways, when one thinks about the culture of a country or a region or a people, one of the first things we think about is the food. And so if shifting dietary habits is something that touches so deeply with people, that I think we need to do it in a respectful way, and we need to discuss it in a respectful way, and recognize the centrality of food to the human experience and human cultures. And I think this is nowhere more important than when it comes to meat consumption, because the fact is, livestock consumption is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. That's a scientific fact. But it's also the case that livestock consumption is absolutely central to the cultures of many, many countries. And certainly that's true in my country, in the United States. I mean, when you think of the United States around the world, people think about hamburgers and French fries, right? And that's just kind of core to Americans' diets for many, many years, core to what people think about. And so, and that's true in different countries around the world in a lot of different ways. When we think of, you know, in China, rice is, just to pick one example, absolutely central to the culture. And by both livestock emissions and rice production are major sources of methane emissions. And so we need, as we think about the global warming challenge, we need to think about how to reduce methane emissions from both of those sources in a respectful way that respects people's culture.
Thanks, David. Does Pern and Sally, do you have any response to some of Patty's comments?
I think Professor Sandler already provided a very comprehensive answer, and I just want to add that I feel very hopeful and fortunate that we have this group of very interdisciplinary people to come together and solve these very interdisciplinary issues between food, climate, nutrition, health, and a just transition process.
Yeah, just maybe one point about some of the great points made by Patty is because some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves and try to answer with these country spotlights are, as I mentioned to begin with, are the NDC targets in line with the data, and are the actual policy actions in line with the NDC targets? And just looking at the data that Sally was presenting, how pre and post-production emissions are such a significant part, but they are not well represented in China's NDC. And I think, as you have pointed out from the analysis your foundation made, is the case for many, or probably most countries. So it's certainly very interesting how agriculture and land use management are still at the central there. But then when we look at some actual policies that have been implemented, they are maybe less about the production side and then more about, the cultural shift, like reducing food waste in the catering services at home. Even some action that is mentioned is, promoting cleaner cooking methods, etc. So in some ways, the actual actions are not, they are more focusing on the way Chinese people consume and waste food, and not on the production side.
Which maybe doesn't kind of open the mind, and people won't welcome this kind of talking with open arms. You're kind of hinting there. Patty, do you have any other comments? Do you want to ask them, or?
That's it for now. I want to really make time for Junjong
Okay,
and Karen.
good. So Junjong, thank you again. Columbia University represented very well here this morning in our panel. And Junjong, could you share your slides? And we're going to go down on the farm and kind of see, because China has been trying to implement lots of ag policy reforms, and he's going to give us a sense of how that's been going.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone. That was very interesting. I think the talk presented a very broad context for my presentation. I will use a few minutes to run through a few slides about the top-down and bottom-up and initiatives of greening the agriculture sector in China. So to give you a brief kind of a context, I just want to mention the story of which I call the two worlds of agroecology in China. So these two photos were taken in Shanghai in 2012 when I first started my PhD research fieldwork. And it was the annual exhibition of organic food called BioFact China. And this large event has thousands of participants. And there were two meetings going on at the same time when I was there. So the upper photo you can see is the organic conference, which was joined by a huge number of organic food companies and also government officials talking about organic food certification standards and the ways to improve profitability and better access to foreign market for exportation, discussion about exportation. And outside the auditorium, there was another event going on, and there was a totally different group of people. These are mainly smallholders, small farmers who are doing organic agriculture and community-supported agriculture farmers in particular. And also they were joined by representatives of civil society organizations, NGOs, who provide supports and services for all these small agroecological initiatives. And they are talking about a totally different set of topics as well. They were not interested in certification. Instead, they were talking about alternative ways of marketing, getting access to customers in different ways. And so I kept asking myself, this sharp contrast between these two groups of people, they're not talking to each other. They're looking at different questions. However, essentially, they're working towards the same goal of greening China's agriculture sector, but in very different ways. So how this difference, how are they different, and how this difference, what the difference will imply for the future developmental trajectory of China's organic and agriculture sector in general? I think this is a very important question to ask. And so a lot of these topics we covered in my co-author book with a few colleagues at University of Waterloo in this organic food and farming in China. So I will, with that in mind, with that question in mind, I will quickly talk about, what is going on in the agriculture sector, and specifically, what is going on in terms of greening of the agriculture sector. So we know that in China, after the foundation of the PRC in 1949, there has been a series of political turmoil that has led to, restructuring of land and labor resources. We know about the collectivization period in late 1950s, and decollectivization happened in 1978 and onwards. And in 1990s and 2000, there was a huge amount of farmers migrating to the city, and we started to see a decline of agriculture forces, labor forces, and the labor force decline has created a perfect environment for the involvement of large capitals. And so we've seen the rise of diverse actors in the agriculture sector, especially farmers cooperatives and agri-food businesses and big household farms and family farms. And many of these large agri-food businesses were designated as dragon-head enterprises, and they were called the new subjects of agriculture in 2013 by the government. And in this process, especially after 1990, we've seen the emergence of a series of government-led ecological agriculture schemes. These are certification schemes that include not just organic food, but also green and hazard-free food. So these two schemes are different from organic. They're less stringent in terms of the standards. And in 2010, we started to see the emergence of a group of initiatives, agroecological initiatives. Researchers call them alternative food networks, or AFNs. And these include, for example, ecological farmers markets, community-supported agriculture farms, buying clubs, and many others. And in 2013, the government coined the term 1 control, 2 reduction, and 3 basics, 一控二减三基本, if you know Chinese policies, to refer to various policies to reduce agricultural pollution. And that has been a new kind of the most recent policy changes in greening agriculture sector. So I just want to highlight that the development of ecological agriculture in China is happening within this rapid changes of institutional and policy environment. And so a lot of the features were defined and has been reproduced in this process. And we've seen that the government has provided various kinds of supports to the sector. These are what we call the top-down initiatives. These are initiatives run by large agri-food businesses, and most of them are, as I mentioned, are designated as dragon-head enterprises. These are the leading actors in the modernization of China's agriculture sector. In addition to all this support, we found that there are various problems, when we take a closer look at the government's top-down initiatives. First is that the government considers the organic and ecological food market as a niche market that is not to be mainstreamed. Therefore, a lot of these policies are designed for a few large producers and exclude the majority of small producers from accessing this policy supports. In China, we know that there are more than 200 million small producers who actually constitutes the majority of the food production force. And on the other hand, I also want to mention that the government commitment to ecological production is shallow. They aimed at technologically intensive and highly managed forms of ecological agriculture. If you go to an ecological farm in China, you see that a lot of the farms are is like the model farm, and it's very clean and tidy, and there's no weed. However, a lot of the other ecological small farms that follows the ecological principles are not recognized by the government, and they are not endorsed or supported by the policy. And these 4 types of alternative food networks are what I found to be the major kinds of grassroots initiatives, bottom-up initiatives happening after the food safety scandal happened in 2008. We know the melamine milk scandal, and there was a huge concern about food safety, and so people have tried to find various alternative ways to access safe food and ecologically produced food. These initiatives include community-supported agriculture, ecological farmers markets, buying clubs, and recreational gardening. Recreational gardening is an interesting example because we don't have community gardens within a city like in China. So instead, Chinese citizens started to rent small plots from farms located in a suburban area of big cities, and they traveled once or twice a week to the farm and grow their own food without using any agrochemicals. And this map from the CSA network in China shows the distribution of all major kind of CSA farms and ecological farmers markets and some other kind of civil society organizations that provide support for these initiatives. There are more than 1,000 of them now, and it's still rapidly developing. And they are becoming, I would say, a food movement. It's a group of people, aiming to develop a sustainable food system. However, I also want to emphasize that they face various challenges. The first challenges is that food sold through these channels are quite expensive compared to those channeled through conventional outlets. And on the other hand, there are farmers, ecological farmers, who find it difficult to get a premium price. Some farmers only were able to sell 20% of their organically produced food with a premium price. Most of them were sold as just conventional food. And there's a lack of support organizations, unlike what we have here in North America. In China, support organizations find it difficult to get registered because of this strict control of civil society. And it's also partly because of the lack of trust and solidarity among the community. Farmers are unwilling to share farming practices with others, and they're unwilling to pay membership fees and join these organizations. And there are also conflicts and rivalry, not just among these farmers, ecological farmers, but also between these farmers and local villagers. A lot of these farmers are what we call new farmers, and they are well educated, and they have these agrarian dreams, and they went to the countryside and rent a farm and started to do ecological farming, and they are having a very different set of values, and they have different ways of farming, and so there are all kinds of conflicts between them and the local villagers. So if you want to learn more about the ecological agriculture sector, I would encourage you to Google ecological agriculture in China, and you're welcome to visit our website and follow me on Twitter on South China Food. And I look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Zheng. You gave me a nice walk down memory lane, because I had some friends in Beijing that every time I'd visit, I'd go to their, I liked how you call it recreational farm, but they were really growing food, but there were farmers that used to, because as Beijing expanded and took over their land, but there were areas carved out. So farmers who used to actually farm there were there to kind of also help maintain the family's farm. And it was a lot of fun. But thank you so much for your comments. Want to remind the audience, we're starting to get some questions coming in. Please submit your questions now so I can start asking these panelists, make them tough questions too. These guys are good. All right, Karen, could you share your slides and we'll hear your stories. I love it how when I bring people together and I'm like, did you guys like coordinate? This is awesome.
Yeah.
And it looks good, Karen.
大家好, hello everyone. I'm here today to talk about sustainable agriculture. We've had a lot of discussion about how agriculture needs to change and to become more sustainable to combat climate change. So I went about looking for some success stories to help us decide how to, achieve sustainable agriculture to combat climate change. So, a definition of sustainable agriculture is that it is capable of maintaining productivity and usefulness to society indefinitely. And to do that, it needs to be resource conserving, socially supported, commercially competitive, and environmentally sound. So the types of farming systems that fit this model of sustainable agriculture rely heavily on organic fertilizer, manure, sewage, compost, to provide the nutrients and the organic matter that the soil and the crops need. These types of farming systems also involve crop rotations and keep the ground covered year round, so they grow multiple crops per year. Also, these types of systems grow perennial crops or practice agroforestry in combination with annual crops and grains. So I was able to find an excellent example of this type of sustainable agriculture that use these practices, and using these practices over time, they were able to feed 10 people per hectare with this type of agriculture. And they practiced this particular type of sustainable agriculture for 900 years. So it was truly sustainable. It wasn't just one generation. It wasn't just 1 century. It was 900 years of this type of agriculture. And where did I find that type of agriculture? I found it in the Tai Lake region of China, which is near Shanghai. And from the 1100s all the way up to about 1980, this type of sustainable agriculture was practiced in this region of China. So looking at the how these farmers were able to work, we need to go back and talk to the farmers. And fortunately, we're able to find some of their notes and some of their manuals. So Farmer Shen produced an agricultural manual in the early 1600s. And he talked about how he would go to the city to haul sewage from the city in order to sustain his farm. And in his notes, he noted that for night soil, which is the sewage that they collected at night from each of the dwellings, that Hangzhou was the best place to go. So he would travel all the way to Hangzhou in order to collect the sewage to haul back to his farm. And also noted in his agricultural manual that he needed to mix human waste with animal waste, and that the human waste was very strong, but the ox waste was long lasting, and they needed to, balance their application. This particular style of agriculture was so successful and so amazing that a USDA scientist traveling in this part of the world in the early 1900s, when he discovered it, was so impressed and so enamored with how these farmers were able to successfully farm this area for centuries, that he wrote this book. And this book was then published in the early 1900s, and it's still available today. You can buy it on Amazon, and it's really a seminal work on sustainable agriculture. And anyone that's interested in sustainable agriculture, I'm sure has seen this particular work. So how does this all work? Why does this approach work of gathering fertilizer from the animals, from people, and compost, and bringing it back to the farm? It's because they needed nitrogen. Nitrogen is the key to agricultural productivity. There's no life on Earth without nitrogen, because nitrogen is actually in our DNA, and it's in every protein and every cell. So in order to have living things, we have to have nitrogen. And the agricultural productivity in the Thai Lake region was nitrogen limited. They could only feed 10 people per hectare, and they couldn't feed any more because that was all the nitrogen they could get their hands on. So why did farmers stop farming this way? Why did they move away from this sustainable style of farming and hauling waste from the animals, from people back to the land? Well, there was a move to increase productivity to end world hunger. That feeding 10 people per hectare was not enough. We needed to produce more food on less acres. And in order to do that, we had to farm differently. And this was called the Green Revolution. And there were American scientists like Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize. There were Chinese scientists like Yuan Longping, who won the World Food Prize, who worked and were dedicated to increasing yields. So developing hybrid seeds and new cropping systems in order to feed more people and end world hunger. And they were very successful in this effort, and they developed these hybrid seeds, but these hybrid seeds needed more nitrogen in order to increase their yield. So the organic forms of nitrogen that farmers were already accessing and already using were not enough. They needed to add additional fertilizer. So now farmers are going to the market, buying a bag of fertilizer and spreading it in order to increase crop yield, and it worked amazingly. And so much so that why in the world am I traveling all the way to the city to haul sewage? Why am I hauling manure? It's smelly, it's heavy, it's nasty work. I'm going to stop doing that. And instead, I'm just going to go to the market, buy a bag of fertilizer and spread that, and I'll make more money and do less work. So it was a very logical and easy transition from the old sustainable style of agriculture to this modern style of agriculture. But there's a dark side to nitrogen. Nitrogen is, as I said, absolutely essential for all living things, and nitrogen fertilizer increased yield. But if you apply more than the plants need, which is kind of easy to do if you're not real careful about it, is now nitrogen became a pollutant. And it's become a very serious water pollutant, creating eutrophication, but also contributing to greenhouse gas. So nitrogen is also an air pollutant and is a contributor to greenhouse gas. So when we look at the greenhouse gases that emerge from agriculture, there are three primary ones, and a couple of them have been talked about already today. Carbon dioxide is a known and established greenhouse gas. Methane is much more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and that also emerges from animal agriculture and also from rice production. But the greenhouse gas that a lot of people aren't talking about is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 300 times more powerful and more impactful than carbon dioxide. And that also emerges from agriculture. In fact, here's some statistics from the United States. Looking at all of the sources of nitrous oxide by source in the nation, from all the sources, it's management of agricultural soils, applying fertilizer and managing agricultural soils that is the major source of nitrous oxide. And it's, all of the other sources combined, including, transportation and chemical production and all of those other types of sources don't, all added together, don't equal the sources of nitrous oxide from agriculture. So how can we get farmers to go back to the type of agriculture that they were practicing before, where they were in balance with the fertilizer needs of the crop, and also not applying too much to create water pollution and air pollution? So, we're asking them to start going back and hauling that sewage and manure again, which will increase their workload. we're asking them, don't apply so much nitrogen, limit the amount of nitrogen that you apply. But that's kind of risky. If they don't apply enough, they're going to reduce yield and they're not going to make as much money. And they're not going to be able to support their family. Also, we're asking them to start to grow multiple crops per year to keep that ground covered year round. But there needs to be a market for all of these crops in order to incentivize them to grow them. So what policies are needed to restore our agricultural soils and to move to sustainable agriculture as not as a hobby, not as a recreation, but as an actual agricultural practice? We're going to need to have more research and technology development to make hauling organic fertilizers like sewage and manure more feasible. We're going to need to incentivize farmers to use less nitrogen. There's a carrot and a stick approach. One would be to limit the amount of nitrogen application through regulations, but also there might be the insurance side. Says, we are going to ask you to apply less nitrogen so that you don't end up producing nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas. And if you suffer a yield loss because you take that step, you have some insurance against that. Also, we need to have incentives to grow multiple crops per year and to develop markets. So one of the incentives is, to grow cover crops in the wintertime. So who is going to teach farmers in order to do all this type of work? In the United States, we have 2 million farmers that we would need to teach. In China, there are 200 million farmers that need to learn about these styles of agriculture. And worldwide, we have an additional 368 million farmers. The agricultural systems educational systems that we have to reach these people are vocational agriculture, mostly practiced in high schools. We have the colleges of agriculture that teach agricultural scientists and do agricultural research. And then we also have extension that reaches out to working farmers in order to teach them new practices. So to learn more about our work at the Ohio State University, you can check my website for the Soil Environment Technology Learning Lab, where we don't treat soil like dirt. Thank you very much.
I've heard you say that line so often, but I still laugh, Karen. You even wrote a blog for me on that, I think, too. Don't treat soil like dirt. Yeah, so I'm starting to get some questions coming in, but I want to give Patty first right to make any observations from our last two speakers here.
Thank you. I love that quote. I'm going to use that.
And you also have to kind of borrow David's tagline about zero carbon, zeroing in on food. Unless you patented it there, David.
I have, so both of your presentations refer to a couple of things. One is this, that, we need better enabling environments, we need better policies, but this is underpinned by a need for a mindset shift or a paradigm shift. Because what we saw, Karen mentioned this with the Green Revolution, like this shift towards maximizing yield around quantity, maximizing calories. And so it's more about quantity rather than quality, right? What happened to focus around nutrition and around health. And that focus around quantity has really driven our global markets, right? How we're producing the food, and the focus on commodities, the focus on efficiency. And so, in order for us to really be changing the policies and enabling environments, actually we have to change mindsets, whether it's farmers on the ground, whether it's policymakers, the whole concept of modernizing, what does that actually mean? The concept of innovation technology, what type of innovation? Is it only technology? Is it also social innovation? And how can we make sure that what has been, successful traditional indigenous practices in the past can be considered modern, right? And innovative, like how do we bring that back? So I guess the first question is for Zhengjong about, given the challenges you laid out, what does need to change in terms of how do we scale these ecological practices? How do we start to shift the mindset from this more superficial programs and policies to kind of support, but not really, ecological agriculture, to make it really much more mainstream within China.
Yeah, thank you, Patty. I agree with you that there is a huge problem with the definition of modern agriculture. The country has spent so much resources and policies on promoting modern agriculture. However, there is a very narrow definition of modern, what we mean by modern. I think it is the time to actually call for a new understanding or new interpretation of modern agriculture. We need to integrate more agroecological principles into the understanding and also the conceptualization of modern agriculture in this educational system and also in policy making. So in order to achieve this, I think we first need to recognize the potential of agroecology in contributing to greenhouse gas emission reduction. I think David mentioned this, that there is a lot of focus on the industry when we talk about carbon emission, but not much attention has been paid to the agriculture sector. And I think if we want to achieve the goal to hit peak emission before 2030, as China committed, we really need to think about the potential of agroecology. And the other thing is really about the education of the general public. It's not just education, educating farmers, but also the general public needs to get exposed to more information about organic agriculture, about sustainable farming, and what are the benefits. So I want to share a story quickly that when I did my fieldwork in 2013, I think, in Nanjing, China, I visited an organic food store and talked to a manager of the store. And I was surprised that the store manager, she is an organic food store manager, and she doesn't know what organic means. And she conflated organic with GMOs because both terms have the Chinese word "ji" in it, right? So organic is translated as 有机, and GMOs are translated as 转基因. So she thought it's the same thing. I was really shocked because we know that organic prohibits the use of any genetically modified organism in the production. So this shows that there is a kind of a gap here in knowledge sharing and also information dissemination about organic and about other kind of sustainable farming and sustainable food practices, and the government has a big role to play. And of course, we need more support for small holders, that we have more than 200 million small farmers. If we don't include them in a movement towards a sustainable food system, we will never be able to transform the food system towards a more sustainable future. And the government needs to encourage the establishment of civil society organizations, not creating barriers for them. Right now, it's so difficult for like an organization that provides support and services to all these farmers to get registered. So they find it difficult to navigate the various kind of policy barriers. So I think that's something the government really needs to think about, to leverage the capacity of civil society to support the development of the sector.
Thank you. And I just want to highlight what you mentioned earlier in your presentation about, for example, this trend of interest, especially in some of the urban areas, to kind of be part of community farming, but it's driven a lot by the food safety concerns. So, it's less about climate or environment, but it's food safety and health. So that's, just so important to actually bridge these two. And actually, Chinese culture has a lot to do with like integrated health, like, the whole concept about the entire body is already part of the kind of mindset. So how do we better connect that, as well? Maybe now just a question for Carrie. You talked a lot about, farmer education, and, there's another initiative, Farmer Seed Network, that was launched a while back also in China. And there's also where farmers are actually training farmers, right, peer to peer. And there's also great examples in other countries, like in India, where women smallholder farmers are training other women, right? They can speak the same language, they can talk from their own experience. So I was wondering if you can talk to perhaps, in terms of scaling, how could this work in China in terms of the pedagogy, the methodology, like how do you scale like the new type of education that is needed to really change the mindsets amongst farmers, to really help them understand and learn from one another, to overcome some of those barriers about this, perceptions about risk?
When I'm an extension specialist, I work with the Ohio State University as an outreach teacher. So I teach in the countryside in Ohio. And one of the things that we learn as we're working on technology transfer, because we're technology transfer agents, is that there's we call it the technology adoption, curve. And there are really 4 types of learners. There are those innovators. Those are the people that were at that conference that Jen Zhang put up there. They're the ones who are talking to the researchers, and they're the ones that are on the front lines learning right away about new approaches to agriculture. That's about, maybe 10% of a population. And then there's a big group, probably about 25 to 30% of a population, that are the early adopters. The early adopters are those that learned from their teachers, that learned from extension. They want that research that was done by the researchers that was presented at that conference kind of packaged up for them. And so they learn from extension manuals, they learn from extension videos, from agricultural TV. They're ready to try new things. They're ready to take a little bit of a risk. But there's another big group of people who are the late adopters. They're the ones that kind of hang back and says, well, I'm not too sure about this. I think I'm going to wait and watch my neighbor. My neighbor is going to do this. I'll let them do it first. And then, then maybe I'll try it. So late adopters learn from the early adopters. So farmers teaching other farmers. So one of the things we do in extension is we have field days, we have demonstrations where we bring farmers together. So we don't necessarily teach them directly, but we create the platform so farmers can teach farmers. And then there's going to be another big group of people, maybe 30% or 35% of the population are these late adopters. And then the remaining small percentage, 5 to 10%, are the laggards that are not going to learn, they're not going to try something new. They're kind of stubborn. But that's a small percentage of the population. And so maybe you might even need to regulate against them so that they would, force them to adopt, or they'll just get out of the practice altogether. They'll just retire. So you have to use different approaches for different groups of people. So our educational programs need to think about that and be able to address across that wide spectrum, and knowing that you're not going to get 100% adoption, because there are going to be some laggards.
Thanks so much, Karen, and you, Patty, for your questions. I'm going to want to hop on. We got some questions came in from the audience, and I'm going to group 2 of them together. There's Joshua McBee, a senior associate at Climate Advisors. He asked, are there currently any international efforts to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture? Hold on to that one. And then UJ from South China Morning Post said he thanks us for holding this. Can any of the speakers share some information about what China is doing? And I want to say, just if you know about anything, but to curb methane and nitrous oxides, which are both major contributors to China's greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe, I don't know if, I'd like to start with the Columbia. I know, Karen, you know nitrous oxide, but I was wondering, the Columbia team, you guys are looking a lot at methane. What are you, and you too, Patty, are you seeing in China some efforts that are being taken already to rein in methane and nitrous oxide? And then Karen.
So the Chinese government made a very high profile commitment in this area at the last climate convention of the parties in Glasgow. The Chinese government committed to develop a national action plan on methane and said that it would release that national action plan by this fall, by November, by the COP27, as they say in the climate world. And that process is underway, I believe, within the Chinese government, looking at exactly what methane emission policies will be adopted. And it will involve, I've been told, a broad range of measures, but we don't know the detail. I don't know the details of it. Maybe other people here do. And what I've been told is it's under development at this time. It's a very good question, by the way. Also, the question about international efforts to address nitrous oxide emissions. I think Karen Mansell's presentation really is helpful in underscoring the importance of nitrous oxide emissions. And I don't know of any. I welcome anyone who there may be some, and if there aren't, there should be. There should be, and there should be more. But I welcome anyone who has any thoughts on that.
Karen or Patty? Karen?
Okay, well, one of the things about nitrous oxide is that there's a little formula for forming it. You need to have that excess fertilizer, and you need to have wet soils. So excess fertilizer and wet soils and the right, environmental conditions make nitrous oxide. So think of rice production. You have wet soils and you're applying, nitrogen fertilizer to get higher yields. That's kind of like the perfect environment. But also, in Ohio, we have a lot of wet soils, especially up in Northwest Ohio. We have the Great Black Swamp, and we have excess nitrogen fertilizer. We apply more nitrogen fertilizer than the Chinese do. So the approach that we're using in the United States to try to help control nitrous oxide emissions is to use up that excess fertilizer by planting cover crops. So the Farm Bill, which is being discussed now, has a proposal in it to incentivize farmers to plant cover crops through the winter to use up that excess fertilizer. And that is the wettest time of the year, when the soil is the wettest. So at $25 per acre is the number that's being floated right now, but providing a financial incentive for farmers to grow this additional crop in order to use up that extra nitrogen. Now, nitrogen oxide control in rice is a little bit complicated because the techniques that you would use to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions in rice production increase methane emissions. And if you want to reduce methane emission from rice, it increases nitrogen oxide emissions. So the types of practices that control one increases the other. So it's pretty complicated in rice. And I'm just starting to really explore that to see what kinds of policies are possible in order to control, emissions. And that's what I'm hopeful that this deep dive that they're taking on methane emissions, especially from rice, will have to shine a light on that.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, so might have to have a nitrous oxide meeting. Let me just grab a couple of these.
Can I make a point?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So indirect point, but an important point that we like to say, and I'll throw another saying. We say it's not the cow, it's the how, right? So when I see a lot of times proposed measures around reducing methane and referring to livestock, it's often, how to reduce emissions per cow, basically, when actually there's a kind of, the question we should be asking is actual livestock production practices. So for example, we call CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, where you see usually the pictures of like beautiful cows roaming on the grass and, on the hills, and actually where most of the kind of main production of meat comes from is not from those cute little cows in the green fields, is these kind of really horrid looking feedlots where they're feeding on grains, and that are like commodity produced for export, of which, as David said, a third is lost right before they, either lost before they reach the farm gate or lost in the consumer side. And so how do we start to make that switch in thinking about the actual total production system on the farm, where animals are integrated, either grazing where you can't actually grow crops on grassland because actually making the soil healthier, or they're integrated into a diverse multi-crop system so that they are actually feeding into one another in a full ecosystem approach. So I think we need to be thinking about emissions as a whole, as a set on a farm, or let's say a region, rather than each specific crop or livestock in particular. I think it's important balance when we start to think about this need to move from just a pure, let's say, agricultural commodity perspective to a larger food systems perspective.
Thanks, Patty. Okay, we got a few minutes here left. So the first question we got in early on was from Ben Cross from New Synergy Energy, and said, David, do you see and it could be for anyone on your team, I think, do you see a significant growth in indoor farming, grow houses and greenhouses to combat climate change and to reduce the use of energy, water, fertilizers, and pesticides? So that's kind of another system change too.
It's a great question, and I am going to flip that to Hern, who is the expert on that topic.
I was thinking, I just thought, yeah, Hern, real quick.
So the fact is that we need to start growing more food indoors in controlled environments, and we see this. We see that trend all around the world with agricultural regions that we have relied on for food production are finding it increasingly difficult to grow outside. But you cannot talk about growing in a controlled environment and greenhouse production without talking about the energy and the source of the energy, because it all comes down to how are you producing. So that is a big challenge that the greenhouse sector is actually facing. And I know that it's a great challenge for people in the Netherlands, the global leader in greenhouse production, because they are relying heavily on oil and gas to warm up their greenhouses. So if we can use waste heat from industrial plants or geothermal sources that are not to be found everywhere in the world, then yes, there is a possibility, but it all comes down to energy and the sources.
I have to say that when you're looking at greenhouse production, China has tremendous adoption of greenhouse production. 90% of the greenhouses on planet Earth are in China. So China has definitely adopted that particular approach. It's also good to point out that those greenhouses are plastic. So there's a lot of plastic use, which is dependent upon fossil fuel for the production of plastic. So it's not just heating them, it's also making them. And because most of them are plastic.
But the complicated is that obviously, but using the plastic on the greenhouse and plastic mulch has been sometimes a climate adaptation strategy for farmers, right? They're able to grow more things using less water and growing in colder climes. So yeah. So basically today we're opening up how complicated this question is of food and climate. A couple last questions here. Ted Lung, one of our fellows at the Wilson Center, said in 2015, the French government tried to create a fanfare around its 4 per 1,000 initiative to increase carbon in the soil by 0.4%, 4 parts per 1,000. So the idea of using soil as a carbon sink is whatever happened to this initiative? Is there any traction of this model for projects in China? So I guess the question is like, is China looking at, I don't know if Hern and Sally or David, you guys know that, is China looking at, as soil as a carbon sink?
Jennifer, I've looked into the 4 per 1,000 initiative. A lot of it is the challenge for it is documenting it. You could include soil sequestration of carbon in carbon markets, but how do you document it? So that's kind of the big gap right now that still needs to be closed. We know how to do it. We know how to sequester carbon in soils. We are still learning more ways, but we have some initial ways. It's just that the documentation to support the carbon markets, I think, is the big gap.
Okay, and then the last thing here is that we had a couple people, the South China Morning Post guy and also Yifei Li from New York University in Shanghai, hi Yifei, ask about the plant-based protein sources in China. If this is a possible, because this would be a mindset change as well. Is this, are there policy level initiatives for it? Could this work? I don't know who wants to, using plant-based sources of protein instead of meat-based sources of protein. Anyone have you heard this? Is this something that you've heard about, like Zhenzhong?
Yeah, I think there are some recent policies support for plant-based protein, and the government's trying to encourage the development of new initiatives and new business adventures in this sector, just from the perspective of food security, because we know that China has been, giving much emphasis in its policy on food security, especially self-sufficiency in food. And meat consumption has been relying so much on imported soybean and to use as animal feed and also produce all kinds of protein-based food, other kind of protein-based food like tofu, right? So it's popular in Chinese cuisine. So I think it's still at a very early development stage, and there are different kind of plant-based proteins. We have lab meat that is considered as a high-tech industry by the Chinese government and it's encouraged a lot. We also have those traditional plant-based protein making, converting soybeans and other kind of plant food to soybean to protein products, like similar like meat-like soybean products, right? It tastes really like meat, but it's really soybean products. And this has been in the Chinese food for a long time, I think for decades, and people have been consuming it. So it's nothing new. But I think the policy is really aiming to support this new technology development like lab meat and other. But we still, I think that we need time to actually see how successful it will be.
And maybe just, we're just hitting a time, but so maybe Patty, quick comment. Just give me, everyone give me 15 seconds or something.
Quick comment. So one is we profiled a great initiative in China called the Good Food Fund, where they're doing things like training chefs on how to, basically cook without meat and use alternatives. So it's about actually training on the ground, like really kind of building up that public awareness. And then just going back to the soil point, it's also about, China has one of the hugest kind of rates of soil loss in the world and is not considered part of the climate agenda. But if you talk about framing around soil health and retaining soil, that actually there is huge potential to kind of bring in those practices that David and Zhenzhong mentioned about agroecology, regenerative practices. Like this is all one and the same. It's about just how do you look at the issue?
All right, just one quick round robin. I want you guys to give me like one sentence, because U.S. China cooperation in this sector. David, start us off. What do you think would be the most kind of good place for us to start between U.S. and China on our conversations on food climate emissions? I'm being cruel here, giving you like one answer, one sentence.
Methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. There's a lot we can do together. Get our farmers together.
All right, Patty.
Pass until the next round. Sorry.
What was that?
Skip me. I hate to think.
Skip it. Okay, Hearn. It's like a game show.
Yeah.
Get ready, Sally.
More engagement, more conversation. I mean, these are are two major players, and they both have ambitious targets and in many ways facing similar problems. So get together and work on them together.
Okay, Sally.
I think in general, more information sharing and more specific, I think collaboration and communication between universities, because I feel like in solving the problems, technology innovation is a very important part, and universities are a lot of these innovations and developments going on. So yeah, very important, like universities and think tanks communication.
And maybe also kind of just following on your spotlight, because your spotlight used a lot of FAO data, maybe US and China, taking your spotlight as a model, the US and China getting on the ground, you could get more data, from the actual people like in China and the US on this as well, make it more real. Because what was your tagline, David? Like you need data. Yeah, you got to have data to make change. What was your tagline?
We can't get to net zero emissions without zeroing in on the food system.
So you need the data. All right, Zhenzhong, U.S. China cooperation on this topic. One sentence. Where do you want to go?
My experience tells me that Chinese farmers are, and also Chinese civil society actors are interested in learning what other countries have been doing, especially their civil society organizations, how they are supporting their organic farmers, their sustainable farming practices. So I definitely would say that we should encourage more kind of information sharing, and especially among civil society organizations.
Okay, Karen, your one sentence.
Reestablish the China-U.S. agricultural exchange that started right after ping pong diplomacy. It was the first and longest, relationship between the two countries, and it's been recently, lost. COVID didn't help that either, so we need to reinvigorate that.
Because you went on those, so did
I went
Xi
on that.
Jinping.
So did Xi Jinping.
Okay, Patty. Now I gave you a few seconds.
All right, yes. Look to the past to find solutions for the future.
Great. I should have warned them I was going to ask them this question, but so basically your answers has set some of my meeting agendas coming down the pike. So I want to thank the audience for listening in and asking great questions, but particularly the speakers. Cruel and unusual, we didn't have enough time, but this was a great way to get the conversation started. And also want to thank the Environmental Change and Security Program for co-sponsoring. And if you're interested in plastic, I've got a meeting on the Global Plastic Treaty on Monday that's looking at US and Japanese cooperation on plastic issues in Asia. So we'll talk a little bit about China too. Thank you very much and have a good morning, everyone. Bye-bye.